Yeah, that was a theme. Yeah, people asked, what
This
are we going to do with these things?
they did, and we didn't know. We thought it was recipes. This is the Open Global Mind weekly call on Thursday, July 10th, 2025. We're reminiscing on early PC days, which were more innocent and heady and free and who knows what else. Like there's probably a lot of other nice terms we could add to that. Um, but that's how a lot of us learned about all this stuff. We have a topic that was left over to us from last week, which is a really nice topic. On stacks and stories is just my shorthand for it. I'm interested in everybody's interpretation of it. But it's a combination of two things that are in some of our heads. One of them is the notion that I'm just realizing that the shirt I chose to wear today has like all kinds of interesting moire effects on video. Oh, making my head hurt already. Um, the first force is this idea of stacks and that there might be some new stacks that we're going to live in and with over the next 50 years, that the old stacks are obsolete and broken and everybody's protesting about them, and how do we reconstitute them? But the second force is the power of narrative. And I think here maybe focused the power of narrative in convincing a whole bunch of humans to follow their, leaders or story makers onto or into different stacks. And I will point here to, the neoliberal stories that led people to say, yeah, we should do all these things about neoliberal. We should lower the barriers to trade worldwide and not worry too much about protecting the workers. And no, it's all going to work out. Or the story way before that of the invisible hand, that, don't worry, economics pencils out just fine because there's this invisible hand in the background that causes things to find equilibria that are fair and reasonable, and so on and so forth. Those are stories. Um, and we buy them, or somebody buys them, enough people buy them that the movements or the platforms become hugely popular, and kind of eat our world. And they eat our world in a way that is more profound than we realize. One of the reasons why The Great Transformation, Polanyi's book way back when, The Great Transformation is one of my favorite books, is that he is an economic historian describing the transition from pre-industrial Britain to early industrial Britain. And he talks about what life was like before and after, and the changes are startling. They're really like, it's remarkable how many things change when we shift platforms, this stack idea. And I realized also that a lot of people have probably talked about civilizational operating systems or civilizational OSs. And the stack is kind of an elaboration on that because one of the elements of the LAMP stack is an operating system, right? The L in LAMP is Linux, but there's other sort of elements to it. And there's this multi-layered, multifaceted aspect that I think is interesting. It's not just here's a program, run it. It's here's a bunch of ways of doing things. Let's try them out. Anyway, that's just my riff to warm up the conversation. I'm interested in, just for starters, how any of you, where does that land, and take any of you if you'd like to jump in on that. Eric asks in the chat, can we apply the innovations of the space race of the 60s to create a humane AI race? Which took me immediately to the origins of Star Trek and the desire. And Eric, you might have been thinking that as you wrote that, but like Star Trek was a narrative, a series of narratives about how to run society and how we bump into alternate societies and how we should interact with them in the Prime Directive and all those are all rules and stories all nicely fused together, into a package. So, Gil, please.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'll be mostly off video today, but I like the provocation, but my first reaction is a stack feels awfully linear. A awfully linear way to describe something I think is much more messy and intertwinkled than that. So I'm in mycelial networks.
And as am I. And thank you for pointing out those relationships.
Yeah, and I'm not opposing the stack idea, but it's, it comes out of a particular narrative and framework and operating system of operating systems of the software world. It's powerful. It's pervaded. It doesn't just show up in geeky conversations like ours, but it's sort there's a delayed reaction on narratives. I mean, the stack metaphor is making its way into general society, just as we need to be thinking about maybe there's some other way of organizing our stories. Anyhow, that's all I got for the moment. I'm going to go back on listen and thank you.
But Gil, you've started a really interesting piece of this conversation, I think.
Okay.
And I want to address it a little bit because partly there's an inspiration here of how Unix works. Unix is really just a big grab bag of utilities that happen to work nicely together.
Yep.
And the way that they work nicely together is more toward the thing you're saying, which is organic and remixy and sort of generative. But it's still code, and there's this risk of using a computer metaphor of entering the landscape of, oh, our brains are like computers, and all we have to do is think about the big machine, and we'll figure everything out. And that's not my intention with this really at all. And separately, I have bought the domain thebigfungus.org because I believe so beautifully in mycelial metaphors, but I'm also seeing that many, many, many people are trying to figure out how to describe the next thing we're moving toward with modest success, most of them. And some of them, I can tell their hearts are in the right place and their ideas are great, but the descriptive means are lacking somehow. And I'm seeing that over and over and over and over in brilliant books that have the wrong metaphor or the wrong language somehow. So this is meant to be an exploration of that space, and maybe we find a language that we like better and metaphors we like better. But I'm finding in my descriptions that the stack metaphor grabs muggles, normal people, because they're like, oh, it's a little bit of a stretch to understand the stack concept out of programming. But once I get it, I'm like, oh, yeah. I see the analogy over.
I think it's really easy for people to understand that that the things that we take for granted sit on top of other things, which sit on top of other things. So kind of digging into the layers of what this all is standing on.
Right.
It's a very powerful way at it. Living Between Worlds next Wednesday, we're going to be stepping into the confusion about strategy and tactics and the mess that people make of that. And I want to add stack. Now, given what you've said, I want to add stacks into that conversation. We're going to take as a jumping off point Gene Sharp's incredible book, From Dictatorship to Democracy, which is available free all over the web, translated into dozens of languages, was the source text for a lot of the color revolutions that peacefully overturned dictatorships in Czechoslovakia and Poland and a bunch of other places. And Sharp talks a bunch about that confusion in that book. So thank you for this. We'll throw stacks into that conversation. You're all welcome to join us next Wednesday at noon, we being me and Ken Homer co-host, and our guest Donald Goldmacher, who's an activist, physician, filmmaker, organizer, who's got some interesting perspectives on all this. And I'll put the link in the chat.
Thanks, Gil. Appreciate it.
I'm going to go off camera.
Stacy.
Thank you. You need a second now.
Yeah, take a beat. We go too fast usually. So
my comment also addressed what Gil said. What I was going to say is that I actually thought about stacks of stories. So the video you sent, George Monbiot, I don't remember his name. Monbiot. So when I think of stacks of stories, like he mentioned, how the stories don't change. So when I think of the Bible story, I see our modern day politics story being exactly the same. I see different stories just layered, it's the same story, the same pattern. And what I wanted to bring up though is, so I really enjoyed that video. Actually, he talks about opposite stories with an identical narrative structure. He also talks about belonging and community, which is exactly what I wrote about in 2018 when I talked about the patterns that I had observed on Facebook. And what I wanted to say to the group was, why is it? Have we diagnosed why that works? Why is it that there are opposite stories, with the identical narrative structure. Because if we haven't figured out why this works, how do we dismantle this system that's operating to keep us in dysfunction? So that was the question that I wanted to throw out.
Thanks, Stacy. And there's lots of people. Jay Golden is a friend of ours and is a master storyteller, and he was in early OGM calls. We've had other people here who focus a lot on stories and storytelling, and I'd love to know more about that. I'm afraid that the actual mechanics of storytelling may remain a mystery to us mostly, but I think studying it makes it a little bit more comprehensible. Gil,
I
your
think
hand
it's
is
obvious. By the way, I think it's obvious. I'm just saying.
Say more. And Gil, your hand is still up from earlier. If you can take it down. Stacy, you want to say a little more?
No, not at this moment. But I'm just saying.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Pete.
Morning, all. I enjoyed Gil's immediate provocation that stacks are kind of linear, and I mean, like visually, it's literally a line, you know. But that doesn't mean that I don't think this is what Gil meant. That doesn't mean they don't have utility. So I like the metaphor a lot, and if I think about it a little bit, the metaphor of a stack is a way of recognizing that you can explain things to people and people can understand things in hierarchies pretty well. So take getting goods from one place to another. It's pretty easy for somebody to understand. Well, first there has to be a road, and then there has to be cars or railroads that go on the road or the tracks. And those are different things. They're managed by different people. But if I'm thinking about something, I don't need to think about the whole transport chain, you know, all the different complexities of it. I can kind of narrow down and think of one level of the stack. So I think it's a really helpful, the reason we have that metaphor is because it's useful to decompose things into different places that have different, you know, different properties and different people who manage them, things like that. I think then it's not just the fact that there's a hierarchy of stuff that manages something. When you say it's a stack of things, you've chosen out of a multiplicity of different kinds of solutions to how you stack something. You've chosen a particular one. You've chosen the lamp stack. And maybe you tweak the lamp stack a little bit. Maybe it's not Apache, maybe it's a different thing or something like that. But saying you can give this whole toolkit to somebody saying, here's a stack that I know works and that other people know works. And then we can talk about modifying something that is more or less a cohesive whole. So I think that packaging of a set of hierarchical parts works really well. It reminds me a little bit, there's another thing that we've seen more recently in software, which is containerization. Another technical thing, it's more of a technical thing than a metaphorical thing, but nowadays it's really common for people to take a whole working system and collapse it into a container, a Docker container, or other ones. And then you have not just a stack inside that, but multiple stacks interacting with each other in a way that makes a whole system. And then you draw a line around that and you say, I just need to know what I put into this and what I get out of it. It reminds me also of thinking of containerization, container shipping as a way of it's similar to packet communications. It's another thing where you abstract, you know, or you condense a whole set of things into one piece, and then you work on it at a higher level. So I really like that Gil said, but what about networks and what about mycelial forms? But the problem that we've got with people is it's hard to, we don't have the metaphorical language kind of to encapsulate a big system network where we can decompose something into these stacks that are then manageable by, you know, by thinking through them and by working on them. So it's not either or, right? It's a, I like, Jerry, that you're proposing kind of using stacks as a metaphor as a tool, not as a description of reality, but as a tool to manage large scale, communication of working chunks of systems.
Hey, thanks. You just recalled into my head a whole bunch of things that are relevant here that matter a lot. That's really super helpful. You also reminded me of the OSI stack, a pedant SPA, physical data link network transport session presentation application, which for a long time was how we were building the networky part of the OSI stack, right? And then application was like, and magic happens here because everybody who was programming stuff knew that application was like a huge world all by itself, right? So it's interesting because each of these stack chunks in programming tries to tackle a piece of the grander solution. And I love that you brought in that LAMP stack happened to be the first famous one. But since then, there have been many a stack, and you pick your stacks because you're choosing an architecture to live within that, as best you can find at the moment in time, suits the things you're trying to get done. So you might have to program in Forth. I just learned that a friend who had developed a game, the platform that the game was published in was actually written in Forth because on the Apple II, that was the fastest thing they could get, right? Forth was fabulous for real-time, like observatories in astronomy were using Forth because the real-time nature of Forth was great. It's a reverse Polish notation language. It's really funky and different and particularly cool. And the VA's hospital system that Tom Munneke and friends wrote back in the day was written in Prolog. No, yeah. Is it Prolog? No, it wasn't Prolog. Anyway, I'll look it up in a second. A language that adapted itself to record keeping. No, that was different. That was the Massachusetts General Hospital multi-user program. So that was a different funky language. But the VA's Vista, Global Vista, was written in something I will find right now and post it into the chat. But anyway, this is all geeky history, but it's relevant because at each point, people are making the choice for the best adapted suite of things that work together to solve for the current problem. Rick.
Oh, gosh.
I know.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I didn't realize coming around so quickly. Yeah, I really enjoyed the provocation about the contrasting metaphors. And as Pete already alluded to, there's no perfect metaphor. There are upsides and downsides. And we're living in a linear world, and so a linear hierarchical world, so that stacks work extremely effective for neo-terrorist propaganda. I mean, we're just living through it. It's just one stack after another stack after another stack after another stack. It's just unrelenting. And so while I'm drawn to the mycelium network ideas, if we're living in a linear world, it's kind of difficult for those metaphors to have the upper hand when it's far more complicated than that. So while you were doing, the reason why I was delayed, I was doing a search actually using AI and say, what are the better metaphors than the ones we're using? And it came up with some additional biomimicry metaphors like murmurations, anthills, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to, do a bit of a deep dive into it because there isn't a perfect metaphor. And the question is, how can you use the upsides of different metaphors to deal with human systems that are far more complex, agile, dynamic, emergent than anthills? And so, this requires a complete rethinking about, how we go about trying to navigate out of our dystopian trajectory because we're stuck. And those stacks are just unrelenting. So I think we need to think broadly about the upsides of metaphors, downsides of metaphors, to see whether we can co-create something that can put our current, to bend the arc of our dystopian trajectory towards a practical utopia.
Thanks, Rick. Jack, my apologies to you. You were totally correct about mumps. That's what they were using. Carl, please.
Oh yeah, a whole bunch of things. I'm glad you had brought up OSI because that was one of the things that came to mind. I know at one of our workshops years ago, we actually had a guy who was at NSA. They were talking about actually turning back some things to the SE Linux group, but his mission was to ban a certain company that had a monopoly in operating systems, because they tried to leverage that monopoly into taking over the web, and they broke the OSI model, and that opened up the can of worms to make the platform complete. He said it was hopeless. It could never be like that. That was like 2007 probably or so. The other thing, well, Jerry, and I know that I'm using the brain, and Ted Nelson also has Zigzag, but you've got photography, the snapshot, and then you've got video, which is like a path, is a sequence and stuff. But then Zigzag and the brain, they get into any object can be any frame can be connected to any other frame. So there's like this indefinite number of pathways through this stuff. But I think the stacks, it's like saying, here's something that we can explain by saying, here's a few things that can stack into layers there. And then bringing up NASA and everything earlier too, the moonshot. I'm actually working with one of my mentors to put together an event week from Sunday, July 20th is the anniversary of the Apollo 11. So the whole idea of that from July 20th to July 24th, when they safely returned to Earth, that was the culmination of JFK's challenge and stuff. So I'm using that so that you've got that metaphor. I'm also, my mentor, Paul Costello, he's for storytelling. And we've been talking a lot about archetypes and things too. So that'll be all kind of wrapped into this, but I should be posting something about the event on Monday in LinkedIn, probably as one of my platforms. So.
Sounds great, Carl. Thank you. Thank you. Kalia, please.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in after Pete talked, specifically about protocols, right? So the stack works because of the protocols between the layers. One of the reasons the ITF won the protocol war is it had better governance of itself, and also a clearer path forward around like incremental improvements one layer at a time. So you could like sort of have two protocols operating, the old protocol and the new protocol between layers, and each layer could move at its own pace in that way. And we have the internet we have today because of these designs. So I think protocols not well understood, often overlooked, like, and there's like both protocols of like how technical things operate, but also how governance operates, right? So I did this research last summer as part of summer protocols, where I looked at the governance practices in the IETF, but like, and I've spent my whole career working on fostering a space for identity protocols to get innovated. But I feel like there's this appreciation for the power that protocols have, and an underinvestment in supporting good ones develop. Anyways, that's what I have to say.
Kalia, thank you. Is that your project? Summer Protocols?
So no, did not, right? They have an amazing, like the protocol kit is really incredible. That was their first summer, the summer of 2023. And I was a fellow in the summer of 2024. So they paid me like magic money for people who don't, not everybody just can do whatever they want because they're retired. Anyways, here's the link to my research that they funded, where myself
Awesome.
and Day Waterbury, dove into the IETF. I uploaded like the entire IETF governance canon into my brain and figured out how it actually worked. Yeah, so anyways, protocols.
And Kalia, you're opening a window that some of us are somewhat familiar with. A few of us are probably deeply familiar with how the IETF and the internet system works. And it is one of those magic stories of a highly functioning set of protocols and layers and, et cetera, et cetera. It's like in our lifetimes, this thing appeared that has kind of eaten the world for good and bad. But how they did it and the fact that it has remained useful, and I'm going to use these words gingerly, and relatively independent. It's so painful to use these words a little bit because everybody's trying to no telco in the world wanted the internet to eat their business, right? They all wanted to be charging us a lot of money for international calls. Anybody remember the last time you paid a long distance phone bill? Like, just lost to history. Anyway, thanks for opening that window, Kalia.
Quick question. Is there a
Yes.
difference between layers and stacks?
Stacks have layers. I mean, the stack metaphor is a layered one. So I
But
think
are layers between the same things where stacks can be different things? That's what I just kind of looked it up. And it
I don't.
seems stacks can
Pete
be,
has an answer for you.
okay.
I don't know if I have an answer, but it's a really smart question. And I was typing up OSI layers versus IETF layers, and I almost put stack in there. Stack, I think implies more more of a complete system at each level. Layers are fairly simplistic things. You could still say it's a stack, but each layer is managing a fairly small set of things conceptually. Whereas, so the OSI layers, each one is handling a different kind of communication and then application stuff to get stuff done. A LAMP stack, each of the LAMP things is a whole big system by itself. So when you say I'm using the LAMP stack, you're saying that you're using 4 layers in the stack, but each of those layers is composed of probably another 10 or 15 layers. So a stack maybe is a collection of stacks of layers.
And Pete's answer made me re-understand your question, Stacy. And so I learned about the OSI stack, that Pete and SPA acronym that I put in a long time ago because I audited a course at Northern Virginia Community College about networking. And they're like, here's the thing. Then later, I learned about how the internet works and TCP/IP, the TCP and the IP and a bunch of other elements that make up the internet map to the layers of the model. So the OSI has a model that says, hey, first we break things apart, then we pack them up into packets, then we put headers on them, then we have a routing table that tells you how to move the headers across the network, then we figure out how to correct for errors, and I'm making this up from poor memory. But those are sort of layers in the abstract model. A real stack says, here's functioning software, and here is what layer each piece of the software corresponds to. Does that help?
It does. And just so you know why I'm asking, it's
Yeah.
because there's going to come a time where I'm going to be trying to translate between talking to people when I'm trying to talk about storytelling and narratives and talking to an audience that's tech people and have a whole different language. And when I use the word layering, I'm going to be talking about maybe different kinds of protocols in terms of the way humans behave, as opposed to protocols the way people program and computers operate. And so layers and stacks are going to mean different things. And so I just wanted to get a sense.
Thank
I
you.
will never be talking about how computers program. My head's exploding.
But you will be talking about how humans work, which is great, and how they work in groups. Eric.
Yeah, hi everybody. So recently I've become interested in studying the space race of the late 50s into the 60s. And John F. Kennedy made the statement, we're going to put a man on the moon and bring him safely home by the end of the decade. And I was taught that that's a smart goal, specific, measurable, etc. And what is a goal for our country, for our society? Do we have anything like that these days? And what could we learn from what came out of that, setting that goal? Look at all the effects it had of mobilizing maybe 100,000 people together towards a goal. And the I've been interested in like the quality control aspects of it that were built in, like learning about that first Mercury capsule, all the backup and redundancy that was built into that, and the astronaut had control of emergency situations. It wasn't entirely automated. And how can we apply all this to the AI race that apparently we're now in with the rest of the world? What can we learn and take forward? So that's just one of my interests now. I saw that Zigzag was mentioned earlier. Around 2016, I started researching the DAT stack, which is now pairs.com. It's just, for me, like, I want to do deep dives and practice, but then things change too fast. And it's hard for me to switch to something new or keep up with the latest JavaScript framework or whatever people are using now. And AI may be able to help that gap, but then you're doing vibe coding now. Let AI do the coding for you in whatever new stacks come up. But there are relationships here, and maybe Zigzag can help visualize relationships. There are tools out there. There's some fractal tools, Zettelkasten related, to track all the depths of your thinking if you want that. But that's just where I am now. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Kalia also added sort of an interesting twist to what you're saying, which is how do we set collapse-aware goals, which I love a lot. Plus.
Yeah, I think we started talking about the stack in last Thursday's meeting, and it was really meant to use the analogy of how stack is being described in software, to apply to the human story. And Yuval Harari introduced the idea of stories as software, really what drives us. But he also made a really remarkable point of saying the reason why we are able to collaborate in large numbers, even between people who do not necessarily know each other, is because of our shared stories. So the perfect example is money. Money is a story, right? So we can collaborate with money because we all believe the same thing. So he never really mentioned stack in his writings, but what he did say, what he did refer to was a pyramid. So a pyramid implying that there's a foundation from which you build up. And the pyramid that he was referring to here as the base is really values. And values are embedded in every single culture. It doesn't matter whether it's Buddhism or the Abrahamic religions and so on. So there is a value structure that underpins how we agree to collaborate. And then from there you build up, which creates a shared trust, right? So we adhere to these values, meaning we can trust each other, from which we can then collaborate in more complex forms. And the challenge today really is we don't have shared stories. I mean, think of climate change. So stories are being purposefully disrupted, so they can't take root and foster collaboration on a large scale in a direction that one group doesn't want to go in. So there's really a fight over narratives, we call it, or a fight over stories, and that's really the challenge. And I think the advantage or the attractiveness thinking about stacks is that it conveys story as software. I think this link is really profound, because it really operates that way. People react to what they believe. They interpret reality through the screen of stories that they have come to believe in, and respond accordingly. So I see that as a central theme, of talking about stacks in terms of storytelling, narratives, and finding ways to collaborate on a larger scale. I mean, the stories have the capacity to create swarm-like behavior. I mean, where we collaborate intuitively on in very large numbers, millions of people. I mean, at wartime, for example, is a great way to describe that. And so stories and narrative with purpose, right? I mean, building a stack on purpose, designing a story like this, I think, would be a great way to go with here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Klaus. You're reminding me of the stories we told in order to go to war with Iraq, a country halfway around the world that hadn't attacked us, while ignoring other countries that in fact had. But the stories were sold at the United Nations in different ways with evidence and other kinds of things. And one of the questions all of this raises for me at the geopolitics level is, how does anyone throw their body in front of a story to derail it or shift it or morph it or blend with it so that it doesn't become lethal, so that it doesn't become completely dysfunctional? Because many of the stories, I think in this conversation, we're trying to figure out what are the positive stories that will help motivate people to build a more positive future. Hurrah. The vast majority of stories we probably can tell stories about are negative stories that cause great dysfunction and pain in the world. And that's, I think those are the ones that shape so much of what's going on. Pete, please.
Thanks. I wanted to relate something else interesting I know about, I think of in relationship to computer stacks, which is they kind of smear over time. So one of the most striking ones I can think of is the way that we represent characters in binary code. And I'm not going to get technical, but the current way is from the 90s, and we can represent characters from all the different languages in the world, all the ones we know about, and lots of emoticons and emojis and stuff like that. That one is built on one from, well, let me do it the other way around. In 1870, Emile Badeau in France said, these Morse code things are really cool, telegraph is really cool, but we ought to automate that. And he came up with this way to represent 32 different characters with a binary code, which was a completely bizarre thing to do, I think, at the time. But then that allowed them to automate moving characters across wires. And so it's a short set of steps, but we have right now the stuff UTF-8 and Unicode are very similar in a way to Badeau's original 1870s code. We went from Badeau to ASCII to extended ASCII to Unicode. But it still looks the same. It still acts the same. So literally the stuff that we're doing on the web with all of our fun characters and stuff like that was kind of thought up. The ideas of it were coming from the 1870s and then modified. There's also a fun story, the same kind of story. There's a fun story where somebody kind of put together a timeline. Hey, you know, the Romans came up with the fact, came up with two horses pulling a cart, and that made two ruts in the road. And so hundreds of years later, thousands of years later, English wagon makers, you know, need to use the roads, so they kind of put the wheels in the ruts. And then you invent trains, and the tracks kind of end up in the same width of two horses. And then, you know, sooner or later you invent the space shuttle, and you build the rocket boosters in one place, and you need the rocket boosters shipped to another place, and you need a train track to do that. So that's a little bit of a fanciful one. It's not quite as a direct line, but is a good metaphor for there's kinds of stacks that not only like shift down in a hierarchy, but also shift backwards in time. The older stacks that you build on are often hundreds of years old or thousands of years old. So I think there's something useful there as we think of using the stack metaphor to help people understand the physical world and physical networks of system effects.
Pete, thank you. And we haven't really brought religion into the conversation much yet. And I think the Ur stories that a lot of people lean on are in fact from their source documents or sutras or whatever it might be, right? The places where the culture comes from and leans on. And many of these stories are fantastical. They are not remotely rooted in reality. They are otherworldly. They are in the spiritual realm, whatever you might want to say. But they form at least the nominal or alleged foundation of a lot of people's belief systems and actions, when in fact, a lot of people who are firmly attached to those belief systems seem to be acting in exact contrary means. But that's a whole different OGM call, I think. But I think it's also a testament to the power of stacks to mobilize people and do those things. Stacey.
Well, thank you for breaking that up, because I always seem to go after Pete, and I'm coming from like the whole other side of the spectrum. I was really excited to come to this call too, but I'd rather follow Klaus. No offense, Pete. George ended his call by saying that our task is to tell the story that lights the path to a better world. And that really struck me. And Walt Disney didn't tell me what the future was going to be. He built Epcot and he showed me what the future was going to be. And I believe that that's what we have to do. And I wanted to come here because, Jerry, when I heard you say, what stacks do we need? I took that to be, what do we need to tell these stories and these narratives? And I think there's so many stories we need to tell. And so to me, I thought, well, we need a resource library, a place to put all these stories that we're going to collect and create. And in my mind, that's Pete, go and build us this place where we're going to have this library. Go and do that with your stacks and your protocols and all your letters and stuff that I don't know and I don't understand. And okay. And then we need the meeting spaces, and that's what these places are. But we also need a place to organize these spaces so that we know where each of these spaces are and which conversations are going to be where and which stories we're going to tell where. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And I just, one more thing. I left.
What? One more thing? What?
One more thing, because I just left a really great call only because I was so excited to come to this call. And it was Sharif's call. Is Kalia still here?
Oh.
Oh, she left her. Oh, she's right there.
Yeah.
Right. She moved again. But he was actually talking about, and again, this is what made me think about the layering or the stacking of stories, because, you know, and I'll save it for another time, but going back to words and energy, which I think is where he's starting with, at least for me, maybe instead of worrying about metaphors, we just think in terms of language. So instead of worrying about having to stick to mycelial network or any other, we say, well, let's use nature. And we know mushrooms are part of nature. So we're good enough with the mushrooms and we don't have to be so rigid with the whole metaphor. At least let's know we're going to stick with the nature language. And I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Stacey, thank you. I think this is a good moment to take a moment of silence and just absorb where we are and think about where we want to take the conversation. But I'll bring us back out of silence in a moment. Thank you very much. Where do we go next with this idea? What have we missed putting on the table? Gil.
I have a question, and it clarified when Eric was talking, and it seems that all the stacks we've been talking about, all the protocols we've been talking about have been developed in relation to some kind of common concern or common goal. There's some agreement about what we want to accomplish. We want to build a capacity to do international telecommunications, or to have international shipping using shipping containers. And by the way, there's Daniel Yergin has a tremendous chapter in his book, I forget the name of the book, about the revolutionary impact of the invention of the shipping container as that modularized unit that enabled international shipping and enabled globalization to emerge the way that it did. So anyhow, so all these things seem to depend on an agreed upon common purpose, shared goal. Man to the moon and bring it back alive, etc. In the metaphoric extension of stacks that we're talking about here, cultural, societal, and so forth, we don't have those. And maybe the shared goal is the bottom of the stack. Klaus was talking about values as the bottom of Harari's pyramid stack. There's something at the bottom that maybe it's really hard to do what we're talking about without that. Monbiot illuminating the path to the future, stories of the path, but we also need stories of what's the world we want. That people could say, yeah, I want that too. And then we start building stack on that. Not then. Then is the wrong word because temporally these are not sequential. These are intertwinkled, but yeah.
And I'm really curious about the shared stories that actually resonate because too many of the shared stories to me wind up being I can't find a better than an antiquated expression, but motherhood statements. Like yeah, okay, we want like enough food and this yeah, but they don't sink down into how do we make those things happen in a way that is agreeable to a lot of people, even though it's occasionally tough.
Maybe they do. Cliches show up because they show up. They sound
That's
trite and
slightly
boring.
tautological.
No, yeah, they sound trite and boring, but they keep showing up because they resonate with human experience.
Yeah.
And motherhood may sound trite, but motherhood is there.
Without motherhood, None of us.
Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah. Thanks.
Pete, please.
Gil, thanks for saying a stack is kind of a representation of a shared goal and or goals maybe. And having lived through the IETF and OSI competition and seeing LAMP come to being, it's easy in hindsight to say, oh, the LAMP stack, or oh, the OSI layers, the IETF layers. At the time when they're in development, it's not obvious that this is the one that's going to win. And it's not obvious that it's this particular configuration of things that comprises a good stack. So it's when you're in the middle of it, like we are now, maybe inventing metaphors for the future, the near future, hopefully. It's not like somebody sat down and said, well, we have to have a way of managing communications or developing applications. And there's going to be this thing called the LAMP stack. It's much more of an evolution of competing concerns, and shared goals emerge, but the shared goals are a tussle between different people with different ideas and different reasons they're doing things, and unhappiness with the way it's coming out, and happiness that, so just to remember that as you're developing a stack, it's not pops into existence like a thing. It's much more, it feels much more like a fight. Another thing I want to observe is the success of the LAMP stack. A big part of the success of the LAMP stack is the encapsulation of the branding of it. So you'll notice that we don't have a nice acronym for the OSI layers or the IETF layers. Nobody invented a name for it that carried. Whoever came up with the idea of making an acronym out of Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP, Python. It's interesting how you can kind of like fiddle with the things. Whoever put those together, I don't think that they were trying to make a brand name, but it's a really strong brand name. I remember there was a year when everyone's like, did you hear about the LAMP stack? Are you using a LAMP stack? Well, I'm using the MAMP stack. It's just like LAMP, except it's got, and that crisp encapsulation and branding essentially of a conceptual thing is like super important, and contributed significantly to the success of the LAMP stack, now that we can call it that. So we need to do good PR and marketing as well as everything else.
Thanks, Pete. Doug.
Just to go a little bit orthogonal, but I
What?
think
You're going to go orthogonal on us? That never.
yeah, I sort of have a habit of doing that.
Orthog away.
So turning the telescope around, we're living beings, and there are these four fundamental needs. Like we need to eat, we need water, we need to procreate. And like on a fundamental needs level, those are sort of intimately connected to our emotional mechanism, which is sort of the next first immediate thing to be triggered. And the abstract and the intellectual, the symbolic and the verbal all comes really later, like way further down the chain. So it's really easy in our intellectual prowess and mental body superpowers to lose the connection between the why and the way that we're doing something. And the things that most successfully energize that connection on an emotional level are the things that like become protocols, or the things that become universally accepted. If the emotional component of whatever the protocol, whatever the construct, whatever the frame, whatever the whatever is missing elementally. It's water. The emotions are water, and there is no life without water. Like as a law of nature, as a practical matter, but it also applies in all these abstractions of businesses and brands and protocols and constructs and frameworks, etc. That if there isn't on the part of the creator or creators, if there isn't an inclusion of all of the elemental ingredients, it doesn't happen. There is no life. It doesn't sustain. It's a stillbirth. And Pete, your point about the acronym, the naming of it, energetically, the giving it a name that was an acronym that was living, it was a living thing. It planted it. It gave it earth. It gave it a kind of grounding. And earth is about safety. Earth is about everybody finds it comfortable, okay, safe to play. So all of our words, all of our frameworks, abstractions, and constructs have energetic dimensions operating on other layers of our sensing system and our existence and our beingness. Unfortunately, 4 of the 5 are not part of our current orientation or lexicon. The only one operating is air. It's the intellect. It's the ability to, to spin this thing up that sits on our shoulders and, and keep spinning and spinning and spinning. But as a practical matter, there's our physical body and earth. There's water, our emotions. There's fire, which is the act of transformation, our ability to transform wood into light and heat. And there's space, which is abundance and source and unlimited possibility, and our intuition and imagination. And all 5 need to be present for something to. So I'm complete.
Thank you, Doug. Klaus.
Yeah, I'm making another transition here. I mean, we shouldn't forget that the building of software in hierarchies, we call them stacks, for humanity can go into all kinds of directions. When you think about Nazi Germany, that stack was quite solid, and it really resonated across a very large share of the population, and it had horrific results. And those kinds of stacks happen frequently in our history, now where large groups of people became very violent or very destructive. So there is nothing inherently ethical or moral about building these stacks. They can be built on a very nasty foundation, and it absolutely works. So the recognition that we are really software programmed, in story form, what we come to believe really drives our collective behavior. So the interesting part is now the link to AI and how we are programming AI. And I thought when Elon Musk set out to re-educate Grok, because Grok delivered woke results, which were to anybody else watching it, just the result of logic, right? I mean, the base knowing of a well-programmed AI is basically, the breadth and length and width of human evolutionary knowing, and out of that comes certain deductions, which AI is doing, in a very structured form. And when these outcomes didn't match to what some brilliant guy like Elon Musk expected from it. He started tinkering with the base. And then the outcome was these anti-Semitic diatribes that Koch just released the last few days, and some other astonishing comments that Koch is now making. So you go, have you tinkered? What have you done tinkering with, the algorithms and the stories, right, that are driving the AI? Because AI is also driven by stories, right? It's being programmed in the English language. So I mean, what I've done is consolidate a whole bunch of stories about climate change and the impact on agriculture and the food systems and all of that stuff to train and educate, these agents, and so they respond according to these stories that they have been trained with, right? So there is absolutely. It's very dangerous to not pay attention to the base of pyramid stories that are driving our value system that embeds everything else we're doing. Sort of.
Thank you, Klaus. If you haven't taken a peek into the Mecha Hitler meme and stuff like that, Sean just put a link to it in the chat. It's concerningly entertaining. This may be a phrase. Also, part of the conversation right now reminded me of, and I had to look up what the book was, but long ago, one of the first long novels I ever read was James Michener's The Source, which is about a tell in Israel, and basically it goes down through the layers. It's, a team of archaeologists are digging down through the tell, and then you hear the fictional retellings of the different layers of the city as each city was destroyed or whatever else. I remember it as being pretty good. Michener was good at like historical geographic potboilers kind of. But a lot of current, the Gaza situation, Israel, Pakistan, there are layers of history that are sort of burned into everyone's memory and soul and family that form their stack of beefs and beliefs that cause things like world wars and all kinds of conflict. And a piece of what I think mediators and other people who are trying to make peace try to do is maybe influence how these people see their stacks, or make them see the next person's stack and go, oh, they've suffered too, and maybe we can make peace. Oh, I don't know. That gets really complicated really quickly, but there's a history as stacks, I think, is an interesting part of this conversation. Kalia.
I lowered my hand before because I forgot what I wanted to say, and then I remembered it. So
Oh, good.
Because the conversation came back around, which is really about like this threads of narratives and where we are now, and there's a problem in the cultural discourse of pretty around postmodern ideas taking hold and infecting young people en masse through the university systems, and it's deeply nihilistic. And so cultural critics that are often painted as being on the right, like Jordan Peterson, actually have some key insights into like naming what's going on, and also like saying like there's a problem here. And I think that, and if we're talking about stories, like I think our cultural choice to throw out the cultural anchors and stories that come with the Judeo-Christian tradition like completely is problematic. Like if we're talking about narrative competition, those stories won in Europe at least. And now there's lots of dark sides to what has happened. Like it's not all brightness and light, but if we look at like The Weirdest People in the World as a book talking about the cultural impact the church had on how Like we are who we are today because of certain things. Like I think we have to grapple with kind of like, how do we actually take the good parts of that culture and not just succumb to what they call like cultural Marxism. I don't agree with that naming of it, but the thing that they're getting at, I think there is elements of truth to it. And if we can't get back to or figure out how to like go through like and I'll want to make one more comment about why I think those stories one is important. Like I've spent a bunch of time listening to different versions of history from the last 10,000 years. And one of the things that made a one of the books I listened to that had a big impact was one about all the civilizations that existed before Rome. And there was like 25 of them, and a lot of them lasted for 700 years. We're like at year 250, right? Like, so a lot of it, and if we go back to where we are, humans are cultural beings in a way that no other animal is, and that culture is shaped with story, and those stories won. So what do we do with that, and how do we learn from that? And they form the basis of like human rights law or thinking of individuals, like these things. And we have postmodernists that want to come in and say that sex doesn't exist because it's a like you people like material reality is real, and you can't just live in a thought bubble world where you ignore 1.25 billion years of biology evolution, right? So there's some reckoning that has to happen around postmodernism, nihilism, and like the stories we tell about the West, and how do we get through to the other side where we are respecting indigenous knowledge and systems. But I do not want to go back to the world before we had modern chemistry. And I hear people like attacking the Enlightenment as if it was all terrible. And I'm like, yeah, no. So, anyways, I'll stop.
That was more than a handful, Kalia. Thank you. Really appreciate that. Rick.
I'd like to. I watched a video quite recently, and it's a short one, and it was quite illuminating in terms of just opening a door that I knew was there, but really hadn't gone through it. And it's so obvious that sometimes you have to have the obvious point out to you. And one of the things we were talking about earlier, and Klaus, you were talking about the issue of values, and the thing about stacks of values is they're hierarchical, and they compete with one and each other, and that's where most of our conflicts arise, because we have conflicting value systems. Whereas if we use virtues more as a constellation, as a non-hierarchical way of thinking about how to guide our development, then we don't look at virtues necessarily in a hierarchical way. We look at, well, what virtues do we need to use in a particular situation, a particular context, whatever. And the YouTube was called "Philosophy Eats AI," and somebody mentioned earlier AI. I think AI is something that AI is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the question is, how can we use the good of AI for human development? And I think it's got huge potential, but it's got a lot of things going against it. And I coined this phrase, humanity guided, AI enabled, emancipatory neo-learning. And the reason for that is that our stories indoctrinate us in different ways. And we just have to look at the deranged Trump mass psychosis as an example of an amazing stack of stories. They're deeply embedded where, 60% of MAGA supporters still believe in the big lie. And so that speaks to the power of stories. So the question is, how can we actually use AI in a collaborative way? It's not the solution, it's an aid, that's all. And how can we use it in such a way that we can actually develop as open-minded, truth-seeking, free thinkers collaborating together do good. And I think that's the challenge. But anyway, I put a link into that YouTube, because it was a nice door opener, thinking, okay, let's stop thinking about the ethics of virtues and values and go back, zoom out a little further to different perspectives on philosophy, including indigenous wisdom. And what can we take from ancient wisdom, indigenous wisdom, and modern wisdom, and how can we harness the best? And just quickly, just a point that Stacey, you were talking about, the issue of metaphors. I put a complex question in there about that. I mean, I agree with you. We need to communicate, and the thing is, as long as we recognize the upsides and downsides of metaphors and their heuristic utilities or disabilities, so to speak, then we have to always be wary of any metaphor that we're using, because it's just a proxy. It's just a way of understanding that helps us navigate things. So anyway, that's my musings, and I'm going to do a deep dive into the question I composed, which is we don't have time to address it here, but I'll do a deep dive into it, do an AI search on it, and also do a Notebook LM. If people haven't used it very much, Notebook LM, I'm surprised how well it can actually capture complexity and a conversational tone and make it more accessible to people. So if people haven't used it, I suggest you try playing with it, because if you want to take something complex and convey it to a wider audience who don't read, then you can reduce it to a 6th grade or 12th grade reading level and put it into Notebook LM to put across complex ideas. So anyway, those are my ramblings.
Thanks, Rick. Super interesting. I fear Notebook LM has been eaten by one feature that is very shiny and cool, which is, look, it makes a great podcast that sounds like fresh air. When in fact, Notebook LM is really powerful on a bunch of other dimensions that I haven't been able to begin to grok myself. Relative to what you were just saying, also about indigenous wisdom and so forth, I'm going to post here a link to a draft post, which is probably the next post to my Substack, which is precisely about this topic. And I'd love any feedback anybody wants to send me offline, but I'm exactly aiming to that place, not trying to, as Kalia was saying, not trying to go back to the era before we had penicillin and the World Health Organization preferred pharmaceutical cabinet available, for example, but rather how do we blend the best of the old and the new. But one of my starting point is we used to know how to live in community on the commons, and then I'm going to go from there to how do we blend the best of the old and the new, which is a different post. Anyway, Stacey.
Thank you. And I think I told you that somebody had run my article through through the Notebook, and they made a podcast, and it picked up insights that nobody that actually read it had picked up. So I was very happy that it caught that. What I wanted to share is that I was very heartened. I was listening to an independent podcaster who was on the ground in Florida covering the protest, and they were interviewing a young protester outside of the detention center. And the protester mentioned the importance of intersectionality of the protesters. And number one, the interviewer was smart enough to recognize that not everybody listening would know what she meant by intersectionality, and so went on to continue the discussion that would draw that out. In this particular instance, she wanted to bring out that not only were there people that were interested in the immigration issues, but there was also people that were interested in the environmental issues and people that were interested in the indigenous issues, because the land had once belonged to the indigenous there. So these were 3 different groups that were motivated for 3 separate reasons, all around the same event. So I think that's important as it ties into narrative and, the way it draws different populations. And to go back to my original question, which was, how can we have opposite stories with identical narratives? with that same structure, just very briefly to point out that we often look at the exact same thing, but just from opposite sides. So, oftentimes I have conversations with people and I listen to them and I'm like, don't you hear yourself? You are saying how much you hate something, but you're doing exactly the same thing as what you say you hate. So just something to think about. Over.
Stacey, thank you. Thank you. This has been a really juicy conversation. I really appreciate everybody pitching their hearts and minds into it. I'm curious if we want to take this further, and if so, in what way? Something more, a little more structured or focused, or are there sub questions, or are there particular pursuits we could turn into OGM calls? You could say it now, you could write it to the OGM list, you could send me a separate note out of band, whatever you'd like to do. But I'm clearly really interested in this topic, so I'd love to take us further into it. I think there's a lot of potential here, because as far as I can tell, people are really anxious, and the world is in trouble in several different ways. And people are looking for things like new stacks to anchor themselves in, but not to pour concrete over themselves with. It's got to be, it's like the way to move into the next system is got to be different from the previous ways and the way we think those things happen. Anyway, Haas.
Yeah, I think it actually relates to the way you're interacting with AI. So I created, basically, I didn't think of it in those terms, but I basically created a stack for programming the agents that I've developed. So the story of soil, is the NEO book that we wrote together. That has the evolutionary story of agriculture embedded in it. It talks about spiral dynamics, about theory U. It sets an entire frame in motion, in place, and the AI is absolutely reacting to it. It refers to it. It embeds it in the way that it responds. So when you're building your own AI agents, or whatever, GPT, whatever you want to call it, you should really think of it in terms of building a stack, because you are requiring certain behavior, right? That you want to nurture here. And so I have like a foundation for every time I set up a new GPT. I have a foundation that I put in there, and I engage in the configuration part of the setup with the AI, saying, summarize what you see here, embed this into your instructions, and use it. So I think it is very relevant for anybody working with AI to think about it in those terms, to think about it in terms of stack, building a stack.
Thank you. Rick?
Yeah. What I'll do, and if this is of interest to people, I can share it later. But actually, as this call has been going on, I came up with a question that was inspired by the conversation, and it's a compound ethical question. The beauty about compound ethical questions is there's no limit to it. You can put as much into it as you want, and it overwhelms human comprehension if you read it. If you say it out loud, but if you read it, you have to go slowly. And the nice thing about AI is that you can repurpose the question in different ways to get different angles and perspectives. And so the question I posed there, I go through the 9 different engines on Perplexity, and generate a response to it. And then I ask the question, summarize the commonalities between these different AI outputs. And then I ask for the differences, the discrepancies, biases, sources, disinformation, misinformation, whatever. Even though, it's still just an assistant, you still have to scrutinize and discern the outputs. and then use that output to make a summary page, as well as using the summary page with the AI outputs to do a notebook LM, which you can do at different lengths. You can do brief, medium, long. You can structure it. You can ask particular questions of it. And it's, to me, just a very generative way of creating learning resources that form the basis of co-creating generative and strategic dialogue, so that it's an inverted classroom format where people hopefully look at this in advance, they take it in, and you come to a session that is based on learner-centered generative dialogue. And that's what I mean by neo-learning. We need better learning methods, better emancipatory learning methods, because we're all indoctrinated, and we just have to learn more about the ways in which our stories indoctrinate us, so we can pick out the best parts and get rid of the shit. So that's my commitment. I'm almost done, but I won't get it complete by the end, and I'll send it out to the thing, and people can look at it. And if people are interested, that's fine. If not, I'll use it anyway.
Thank you, Rick. We're nearing the end of this call's time together. Anyone want to ruminate or reflect on the call, or otherwise process what we've been on into? Or crack a joke? John.
Yes, just by the way, I'm in a hyperbaric oxygen tank as we speak. That's the funny background here. Something the reason I didn't bring this up earlier is I couldn't think of examples, and I understood that it was an abstract idea, but something about protocols. I think people initially consent to a protocol for a potentially narrow purpose. I'm thinking of the IETF, but again, I can't quite quote examples of this. And then you start acting with the protocol, and then you realize, oh, hey, this thing is generative. This thing has more potential than we thought. Just like some of our interactions are now, not all of them, of course, but some of our interactions with the LLMs are turning out this way. You go in with a particular narrow idea, and you say, oh, wait a minute, not everything it did was accurate or realistic or useful, but this one idea that I hadn't thought of that at all, and it starts to take you down a path that turns out to be interesting. So that's an aspect of the stack ecology. It's an aspect of the process of trying to create narratives and trying to pull people in to a new stack. It's certainly a part of any kind of I shouldn't use the word progressive because of its other political connotations. But I mean, if you're going to make headway politically, you probably have to get some people to come in on a somewhat limited, almost motherhood protocol. And then they realize, oh, because we're acting in accordance with that motherhood protocol, it's enabling these other things. And okay, now that's something else. And, whatever I think about that. But we would hope that that there's a pathway there. We start with a narrower agreement about something that has relatively broad supermajority acceptance as an incremental improvement. And then once the people start to act together in accordance with that incremental improvement, they discover broader potentials, and they may or may not agree as much about that. But then you've got the thing going. It's in motion, and they're not going to unhook the protocol. They're going to stay with it and play that out. So it's a pretty abstract. I'm sorry I don't have better examples, but anyhow, that was a thought.
Not at all, John. Thank you. And I think you're bringing something that's shown up lightly a couple times in this call. But I think Pete was describing how bottom up a lot of the stack evolution was. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to create a LAMP stack and then let's invent Linux, let's invent Apache. It was like, there's a bunch of piece parts on the table. oh, these work together well. Oh, wait, we need to improve a protocol so that these two will actually fit better together. And then eventually, including, and I'm ignoring here, a lot of commercial competition that throws itself in and says, no, 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 my stack is better. And it happens to be proprietary or whatever, right? All of that stuff happening. But I'm reminded that Doug Carmichael has often chided us for not dealing entirely with climate change and the impending doom scenarios, but also seeming to say that we needed to agree on something for get together first in order to make progress. And I'm unclear that we can ever agree on anything, even broad motherhood statements. I mean, yes, we all want our children's lives to be better than our lives were. That might be a good starting point. But for some reason, I'm encouraged by the productivity of bottom up. I'm encouraged by its generativity, by its flexibility, by the fact that it doesn't cause people to have to sign up to an oath or a thing on top. I don't know. There's something more flexible and human, I think, about that. And I think that shared meaning emerges and is then expressed from within participants in some of these communities. And then at some point rises to the top and somebody says, oh yeah, that's what we've been aiming at all along. Thanks for the great brand. Thanks for the great name, perhaps. But I don't know. I think there's a polarity, there's a tension between top down, bottom up, and that's another interesting thing to explore on this thread. Stacy.
Kalia Identity Woman has inspired me, and I would like to be Stacy Word Girl. And I would like to offer a new word. I would like to, instead of calling people muggles, or I want to throw out the word youngins, I want to just like provide for the youngins, because I think youngins, I want to be a youngin forever. So that's my offering to you.
So how do you spell it? I just put a one version offer in the chat. Youngins, like
You know
that?
what? You may spell it any way you like. It's all about the sound.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, Stacy Word Girl. Kalia, you might be starting a trend here. Gil, you may have one of the last words here and before I pass to Kim.
One of the last words. I agree with you, Jerry, that we don't need agreement to start. Agreement comes later, but it seems like we need some kind of common intention or aspiration or shared concern or some reason that we come together to do whatever we do, as we do on this call. And it's not explicit here. It's not defined. It's not the bottom of a stack, but there's some reason that we show up here again and again. There needs to be some reason for showing up, for
Totally agree.
for the whatever to emerge. And
but sometimes that's sensed, right? Sometimes that's not explicit. Sometimes it's implicit and it's sensed, and you're like, I want this thing.
Yeah. And to the Monbiot thing that Stacy Word Girl talked about before, it's not just a story about the path. It's a story about the world we want,
Mm-hmm.
which may very much be sensed and hard to articulate. Absolutely. Which is why we have poetry.
Oh,
Q Ken.
Such a good segue and a really nice bow put on the conversation, Gil. Thank you for that.
So
Senor Homer.
I'm going to go back to Lewis Jenkins. I think this poem just might fit today. It's called A Place for Everything. It's so easy to lose track of things. A screwdriver, for instance. Where did I put that? I had it on my hand just a minute ago. You wander vaguely from room to room, having forgotten by now what you were looking for. Staring into the refrigerator, the bathroom mirror. Oh, I could really use a shave. Some objects seem to disappear immediately, while others never want to leave. Here's a small plastic gizmo with a serious demeanor that turns up regularly, like a politician at public functions. It seems to be, quote, an integral part, a kind of switch with screw holes so it can be attached to something larger. But nobody knows what. This thing's use has been forgotten, but it looks so important that no one's willing to throw it in the trash. It survives by bluff, like certain insects that escape being eaten because of their formidable appearance. My father owned a large 3-bladed brass propeller that he saved for years. Its worth was obvious. It was just that it lacked an immediate application since we didn't own a boat and lived hundreds of miles from any large bodies of water. The propeller survived all purges and cleanings, living like royalty, a life of lonely privilege, mounted high on the garage wall.
Perfect choice. Again, thank you. That's just beautiful.
Why do these things stay with us when we have no idea anymore what their original use was?
Yeah. No, we have traditions, and sometimes we lose the meaning or the cause of the tradition. There's the famous, or I don't know if it's famous story of the ham at Easter, where everybody cuts a big hunk off the ham. It's like, why do we do that? Well, it's because 5 generations back, the oven was too small.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And Stacy, the Irish have a word for the youngins, which is weans. The weans, which I found by watching Dairy Girls.
Awesome. Is it weans or we-uns? How do they?
W-E-E-N-S or
Just weans.
Yeah, weans. I had to put the subtitles on and then had to go and look up what do they mean by they're talking about their kids, the children, the weans. Gotta take care of the weans, right?
I like that.
And I like it because it's got we in it, right? So
yeah.
We can always be weans even if we're in older bodies.
Wow. Thank you all.
Thank
You make Thursdays a pleasure.
Ciao.
See you soon.